The sound of screeching tires and the metallic crunch of twisted metal filled the air. She barely registered the pain shooting through her body, her senses dulled by the shock of what had just happened. Smoke billowed around her, the acrid scent stinging her nostrils as she tried to focus, her vision blurred and her breathing ragged. She was trapped, her seatbelt digging into her chest, and her legs pinned painfully under the crumpled dashboard. Her hands fumbled weakly at the latch, but her strength was failing her. Panic clawed at her throat, but it was nothing compared to the sinking feeling that overtook her when she saw him. Her husband was there just a few feet away. Relief flooded her chest for a brief moment. He had come for her. He would save her. She tried to call out to him, but her voice was barely a whisper, choked by the smoke and her mounting fear. She watched him move quickly, his eyes scanning the wreckage, and for a fleeting second, she thought he was searching for her. But then she saw her. The woman lying unconscious near the edge of the crash site, her hair spilling over the pavement like a dark halo. Her heart froze as she watched him rush past her, not sparing her a single glance. His hands trembled as he knelt beside the woman, his voice breaking as he called her name. It was a name she recognized all too well, a name he had whispered in his sleep on nights when he thought she wasn't listening. His first love, the one who had walked out of his life years ago, leaving behind a trail of heartache he had never quite healed from. And now she was here, in the most unlikely and cruel of circumstances, and he had chosen her. Pain erupted in her chest, sharper than the metal pressing against her ribs. It wasn't just physical. It was the kind of pain that tore through her very soul, leaving her gasping for air. She tried to convince herself that it wasn't real, that he would turn around and see her. But he didn't. He stayed by the woman's side, cradling her head and pleading for her to wake up, his voice thick with emotion she hadn't heard from him in years. Tears streamed down her face as the reality of the situation sank in. This wasn't just a choice born of the chaos of the moment. It was a revelation, a cruel confirmation of what she had suspected but never wanted to believe. He still loved her. Even after everything they had built together, even after the years they had spent as husband and wife, his heart still belonged to someone else. The sounds of sirens in the distance grew louder, signaling the arrival of help. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, to ask him how he could do this to her. But her voice was lost, swallowed by the thick cloud of despair that enveloped her. She closed her eyes, letting the tears fall freely as the paramedics arrived and began pulling her from the wreckage. She couldn't look at him anymore. She couldn't bear to see the man she loved pouring all of his energy and emotions into saving someone else while she lay there, broken and forgotten. As the paramedics worked to free her, fragments of their life together played in her mind like a cruel montage. She remembered the way he used to look at her, the promises they had made on their wedding day, the laughter they had shared over the years. She had thought their love was unshakable, a foundation strong enough to weather any storm. But now, in the wake of this betrayal, she saw it for what it truly was, a fragile illusion that had been shattered in an instant. She couldn't help but replay the events leading up to this moment. Had she missed the signs? Had she been blind to the cracks in their relationship? There had been moments, fleeting but persistent, when she had felt the weight of his unresolved feelings. The way he would grow quiet at the mention of his past, the way his eyes would glaze over when certain songs played on the radio. She had convinced herself that it didn't matter, that the love they shared now was enough to overshadow any lingering ghosts from his past. But now she saw how naive she had been. As she was lifted onto a stretcher and taken to the ambulance, she forced herself to look one last time. He was still there, his hands gripping the woman's as if letting go would mean losing her all over again. The sight made her stomach churn, and she turned away, biting back a sob. The physical pain from the accident was nothing compared to the ache in her heart. It was a pain that no amount of medical attention could heal, a wound that went deeper than the surface. In the back of the ambulance, as the paramedics tended to her injuries, she felt a cold numbness settle over her. She didn't know what hurt more, the betrayal itself or the realization that she had been living a lie. She had given him everything, poured her heart and soul into their marriage, only to be cast aside in the moment she needed him most. The image of him holding that woman, his face etched with concern and love, was burned into her memory, a cruel reminder of where his true loyalties lay. As the ambulance sped toward the hospital, She closed her eyes and let the darkness take over. She didn't have the strength to think about what would come next, about the conversations and confrontations that would inevitably follow. All she knew in that moment was that the life she had built with him was gone, and she would never look at him the same way again. The sterile white walls of the hospital room were the first thing she noticed when her eyes fluttered open. The beeping of monitors and the faint hum of voices from the corridor filled the air. Her body felt heavy, and every small movement sent waves of pain rippling through her. She blinked slowly, trying to piece together where she was and what had happened. The accident. The crash. And then him. Her heart sank as the memory came rushing back, vivid and piercing. She shifted slightly, wincing at the sharp pain in her ribs. A nurse entered the room, her face kind but professional. "You're awake. How are you feeling?" she asked gently, adjusting the foreline connected to her hand. "I'm..." Her voice cracked, barely a whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again. "Where is he?" It was the only question that mattered, even though she dreaded the answer. The nurse hesitated for a moment before responding. "Your husband is here in the hospital, but he's been occupied. He's been spending most of his time in another ward." Her stomach churned at the words. Another ward. She didn't need to ask to know what that meant. The image of him kneeling by the woman's side at the crash site played in her mind like a cruel looping film. The nurse must have noticed the look on her face because she quickly added, "I'll let the doctor know you're awake. They'll come to check on you soon." As the nurse left, she turned her head toward the window, staring blankly at the faint glow of sunlight filtering through the curtains. Her chest tightened, not from the physical pain but from the unbearable weight of the realization. He had chosen someone else. In her most vulnerable moment, he had chosen someone else. A soft knock on the door broke her reverie, and a familiar face appeared. It was her closest friend. A mix of relief and concern etched across her features. "Oh, thank God you're awake," her friend said, rushing to her side. "You scared us all." Tears welled up in her eyes as her friend took her hand. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "It all feels like a nightmare." Her friend hesitated, her grip tightening slightly. "I wasn't sure if I should tell you this now, but you deserve to know." She paused, as if weighing her words carefully. "Your husband has been spending most of his time with her. The woman from the accident. He's been looking after her." The words hit like a punch to the gut. She turned her face away, biting her lip to hold back the tears threatening to spill over. "I see," she managed to say, her voice trembling. Her friend continued, her voice tinged with anger. "I don't understand him. How could he do this to you? After everything you've been through together. It's unforgivable." She shook her head weakly. "Maybe it's not so simple," she murmured, though even she wasn't sure why she was defending him. Was it habit? Denial? Or a desperate attempt to cling to some semblance of the life they once had? The doctor entered then, sparing her from further conversation. He explained her injuries: fractured ribs, a mild concussion and a sprained ankle. Physically, she would heal with time, but he didn't address the emotional wounds that seemed far more debilitating. As he spoke, she found herself only half listening, her thoughts consumed by the image of her husband sitting at that woman's bedside. The hours blurred together as visitors came and went. Some brought flowers and whispered words of encouragement. Others offered their outrage on her behalf. "I can't believe he's doing this," one relative said, shaking their head in disbelief. "You deserve so much better than this." But no amount of sympathy or outrage could dull the ache in her chest. She replayed the moments before and after the crash over and over, searching for answers she couldn't find. Had there been signs she missed? Had he always carried this torch for his first love, even as they built a life together? And if so, why had he stayed with her? Why had he made her believe she was enough? When the room was finally quiet again, she closed her eyes and let herself sink into the silence. The questions swirled in her mind, relentless and unforgiving. She thought about the sacrifices she had made for their marriage, the dreams she had put on hold to support him. Had it all been in vain? Had she been nothing more than a placeholder in his heart, a convenient partner until someone else came along? A nurse entered to check on her, breaking the silence. "You're doing well," she said with a warm smile. "You'll be up and about in no time." She nodded absent-mindedly, her thoughts elsewhere. She wanted to ask the nurse if she had seen him, if he had asked about her at all. But the fear of hearing the truth kept her silent. Instead, she whispered, "Thank you," and closed her eyes, feigning sleep. As night fell, the darkness in the room mirrored the heaviness in her heart. She couldn't escape the image of him with her, couldn't stop herself from wondering what they were talking about, what kind of bond they were rekindling in the wake of the accident. She hated herself for caring, for letting his betrayal consume her thoughts. But how could she not? He was her husband, the man she had vowed to spend her life with, the man who had promised to love her through everything, only to abandon her when she needed him most. Her phone buzzed on the bedside table, pulling her from her thoughts. She reached for it with trembling hands, hoping despite everything that it was him. But it wasn't. It was another message from a friend, expressing their disbelief and support. "Stay strong," it read. "You deserve better than this." She put the phone down and stared at the ceiling, tears streaming silently down her face. She didn't feel strong. She felt broken, discarded, and utterly alone. And yet, somewhere deep inside, a tiny flicker of determination began to grow. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. She couldn't let this define her. She had to find a way to move forward, even if it meant doing it alone. The hospital room was silent except for the steady beeping of the heart monitor. She sat upright in bed, her fingers gripping the edge of the blanket as if it were the only thing tethering her to reality. Her thoughts raced, a whirlwind of questions and emotions she couldn't contain any longer. She needed answers desperately, and the only person who could give them to her was the same man who had shattered her heart into 1,000 pieces. Her husband finally arrived later that evening, his expression unreadable as he stepped into the room. She studied him closely, searching for any trace of guilt or remorse. He hesitated by the door, his hands tucked into his pockets, before taking a tentative step forward. "You're awake," he said softly, as though unsure of how to approach her. She didn't respond immediately, her eyes narrowing as she watched him. The sight of him standing there, so calm, so composed, made her stomach churn. She couldn't hold back anymore. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling but steady enough to pierce the quiet. "Why did you leave me there?" Her question hung in the air like a thundercloud, heavy and charged. He looked taken aback, as though he hadn't expected her to address the issue so directly. I didn't mean to," he stammered, avoiding her gaze. "It all happened so fast. I didn't know what to do." "Don't lie to me," she snapped, her voice rising. "You knew exactly what you were doing. You saw me there, trapped and injured, and you still walked away. You chose her." He winced at the accusation, running a hand through his hair. "It wasn't like that," he said defensively. "She was unconscious. She needed help. And I didn't," she interrupted, her voice cracking. "I was bleeding, screaming for you, and you didn't even look at me. You didn't care." The words hit him like a blow, and for a moment, he seemed to shrink under her glare. But then he straightened, his jaw tightening. "You don't understand," he said, his tone more firm now. "I panicked. When I saw her. When I realized it was her." Her chest tightened as the truth began to unravel. "You couldn't stand the thought of losing her again, could you?" she said bitterly. "Even after all these years, she's still more important to you than I ever was." He didn't answer, his silence more damning than any words he could have spoken. She felt a fresh wave of pain wash over her, the kind that came from a wound too deep to heal. She had always suspected that a part of him still belonged to his first love, but she had never imagined it would lead to this. "Do you even hear yourself?" she said, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and heartbreak. "You left me to die. Your wife. The woman who's been by your side through everything. And for what? For someone who walked out of your life years ago." "She didn't walk out," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. "I pushed her away. I made mistakes, and I've regretted them every single day since." Her breath caught at his admission. It wasn't just about the accident or the momentary panic he claimed to have felt. This went deeper. He had been carrying this guilt, this longing for years, and she had been blind to it, or perhaps she had chosen to be. "Do you even love me?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Or was I just a placeholder until you got a second chance with her?" His eyes snapped up to meet hers, filled with something that looked like anguish. "Of course I love you," he said, his voice hoarse. "But it's complicated." "Complicated?" she repeated, her voice dripping with disbelief. "No, it's not complicated. You made a choice. And it wasn't me." He looked away, unable to meet her gaze any longer. "I didn't want to hurt you," he said after a long pause. "I never wanted any of this to happen." She laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and hollow. "Well, congratulations," she said. "You've managed to destroy everything anyway." The room fell silent, the weight of their conversation pressing down on both of them. She turned her face away, unable to look at him any longer. Her mind raced, filled with memories of their life together. Moments that now felt tainted by the knowledge of his lingering feelings for someone else. She had always believed their love was strong enough to overcome anything, but now she wasn't so sure. As the minutes ticked by, she found herself grappling with a torrent of emotions. Anger burned hot in her chest, a fiery rage at his betrayal. Heartbreak weighed heavy on her. The ache of knowing she had given her all to someone who couldn't do the same in return. And beneath it all was a gnawing sense of doubt. About him, about their marriage, about herself. Had she been blind to the cracks in their relationship? Had she ignored the warning signs because she didn't want to face the truth? And most importantly, had she been a fool to believe in a love that was never truly hers? Her internal struggle was interrupted by his voice, soft and hesitant. "I'm sorry," he said, his words barely above a whisper. "I know I can't undo what I did. But I need you to know that I never stopped loving you." She closed her eyes, letting his words wash over her. She wanted to believe him, wanted to cling to the hope that their love could survive this. But deep down, she knew that things could never go back to the way they were. The trust between them had been shattered, and she wasn't sure it could ever be rebuilt. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said finally, her voice trembling. "And even if I could, I don't know if I can ever forget." He didn't respond, his silence speaking volumes. She felt a tear slip down her cheek, and for the first time since the accident, she allowed herself to grieve. Not just for the physical pain she had endured, but for the loss of the life she thought she had, the love she thought she knew. As he left the room, the door clicking softly behind him, she realized that the answers she had been searching for hadn't brought her any closure. If anything, they had only opened new wounds, leaving her more uncertain than ever about what the future held. The days after the confrontation were filled with an eerie silence, but it was the kind of stillness that brought clarity rather than chaos. As she lay in bed one morning, staring at the pale sunlight streaming through her window, she felt an unfamiliar weight lift from her chest. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was a glimmer of something else, resolve. She had spent so long tethered to the idea of their marriage, believing that it was her anchor. She thought it was what gave her life purpose and stability. Now she realized it had become a prison. His betrayal, painful as it was, had shown her that she had given away too much of herself. It was time to reclaim it. That morning she made a decision. She wouldn't let his actions define her future. If he had chosen someone else, then so be it. She would choose herself. For the first time in years, she felt a spark of determination, a hunger to rebuild her life on her own terms. The first step was the hardest, deciding to leave the house they had shared. It was filled with memories, both good and bad, but now it felt like a mausoleum for a life that no longer existed. With the help of a close friend, she began packing her things, carefully folding away the remnants of a love that had faded. As she packed, she stumbled upon an old notebook, its pages filled with sketches she had drawn years ago. It was a reminder of the person she had been before their marriage, a woman with dreams and ambitions of her own. "Do you remember how much you used to love drawing?" her friend asked, holding up one of the sketches. "You were always so talented." She smiled faintly, running her fingers over the pencil lines. "I stopped because life got in the way," she said softly. "But maybe it's time to start again." With that small but significant decision, she began to rediscover pieces of herself that she had buried. She set up a makeshift studio in her new apartment, filling it with art supplies and blank canvases. At first, her hands were hesitant, unsure after years of disuse. But as the days turned into weeks, the strokes became bolder, the colors brighter. Painting became her therapy, a way to pour out all the emotions she had kept bottled up. Beyond her art, she threw herself into her work. She had always been good at her job, but now she approached it with a renewed sense of purpose. She volunteered for challenging projects, stayed late to perfect her presentations, and soon caught the attention of her superiors. Promotions and opportunities followed, and with each success, her confidence grew. She wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. But it wasn't just her career that flourished. She began to reconnect with friends she had lost touch with over the years. They welcomed her back with open arms, offering support and laughter when she needed it most. Weekend brunches and spontaneous movie nights became her new normal, filling the void that her marriage had left. She realized how much she had missed these simple joys, how much she had isolated herself in her effort to keep her marriage afloat. One day, while sorting through a box of old belongings, she came across a photo of herself from years ago. She barely recognized the woman in the picture. Her smile was wide, her eyes bright with hope and possibility. Looking at it, she felt a pang of sadness for the person she used to be, but also a surge of determination to find that version of herself again. And she did, little by little. There were small victories that felt monumental. The first time she went to a cafe alone and enjoyed her own company. The first time she laughed so hard with friends that tears streamed down her face. The first time she painted something that made her feel proud. These moments reminded her that she was whole, even without him. Of course, the journey wasn't without its challenges. There were nights when the loneliness crept in, when she questioned whether she had made the right choice. Memories of him would resurface unbidden, and for a brief moment, she would wonder if she could have done something differently to save their marriage. But those moments grew fewer and farther between. Each time she reminded herself of the pain he had caused, the betrayal that had cut so deep. She deserved better than that. She deserved to be happy. One day, while walking through the park, she noticed a couple sitting on a bench, laughing and holding hands. For a moment, she felt a pang of envy, but then she realized something. She didn't need someone else to complete her. She was complete on her own. And if love found her again someday, it would be with someone who valued her for who she was, not for what she could do for them. Her transformation didn't go unnoticed. Friends marveled at her newfound confidence, her radiant smile, the way she seemed lighter and freer. "You're glowing," one of them said during a dinner party. "I don't think I've ever seen you this happy." She smiled, realizing they were right. For the first time in years, she felt like she was truly living. Not for anyone else, but for herself. As the months passed, she found herself looking forward to the future. She started making plans for a solo trip to Europe, something she had always dreamed of but never pursued. She began hosting art exhibitions, sharing her work with the world and receiving accolades for her talent. She even started mentoring young artists, finding joy in helping others discover their passion. Through it all, she held on to one simple truth. She was stronger than she had ever imagined. The pain of the past had shaped her, but it didn't define her. She had rebuilt her life from the ground up, and in the process, she had rediscovered the woman she was always meant to be. And as she stood in her studio one evening, gazing at her latest painting, a vibrant, hopeful depiction of a sunrise, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. She was no longer the woman who had been left behind. She was someone new, someone better. And she knew deep in her heart that her best days were still ahead. As the months rolled on, her husband found himself spiraling into a state of emotional and personal disarray. At first, his decision to prioritize his first love after the accident felt justified. He believed he was acting out of some deep-seated loyalty or unfinished connection. But reality began to set in. The woman he had rushed to save, the one he thought still held his heart, had started to pull away from him. Their once strong connection now felt strained. The accident had brought them back together, but it hadn't rekindled the love he had romanticized in his mind. Instead, it highlighted the cracks that had always been there. She wasn't the person he had idealized in his memories, and he realized too late that his feelings were based on a version of her that no longer existed. The tension grew unbearable until one day, she left him with a simple but cutting explanation. "You're chasing a ghost. And I'm not her anymore." Her departure left him devastated, but it also forced him to reflect. Alone in his quiet, empty house, he began to think about the life he had walked away from. Memories of his wife, their laughter, their shared dreams, her unwavering support, flooded his mind. He had taken her love for granted, assuming she would always be there, no matter what. Now he was confronted with the harsh truth. He had traded something real and enduring for a fleeting illusion. His realization deepened when he began hearing about her success. Through mutual friends and social media, he saw glimpses of her new life, her career flourishing, her art gaining recognition, her radiant smile in pictures with friends. She seemed stronger, more confident, more alive than he had ever seen her. And it stung. He had expected her to crumble without him, to remain broken and tethered to the pain he had caused. Instead, she had risen above it all, proving that she was far stronger than he had ever given her credit for. The turning point came when he saw one of her paintings in a gallery. It was a vibrant, evocative piece that seemed to tell a story of resilience and rebirth. As he stood there, staring at the bold colors and intricate details, he felt an overwhelming wave of regret. This was who she had always been. A woman of immense talent and strength, someone capable of creating beauty even in the face of hardship. And he had been too blind, too selfish to see it. Fueled by guilt and a desperate need for closure, he decided to reach out to her. It wasn't easy. Every step felt heavy with the weight of his mistakes. But he convinced himself that he owed her an apology, even if she never forgave him. He wrote her a long message pouring out his heart, but before sending it, he decided to meet her in person. He needed to face her, to see the consequences of his actions reflected in her eyes. The day of their meeting was one he wouldn't forget. She agreed to meet him at a cafe, her tone neutral but firm. When she walked in, he barely recognized her. She looked radiant, exuding a quiet confidence that both intimidated and mesmerized him. She wasn't the woman he had left behind. She was someone new, someone better, and he felt smaller in her presence. "I'm not sure why I agreed to this," she said as she sat down, her voice calm but distant. "What do you want, really?" He stumbled over his words, trying to articulate the depth of his regret. He told her about his mistakes, his realizations, and his guilt. "I made the worst decision of my life that day," he confessed. "I don't know if you'll ever forgive me, but I needed you to know how sorry I am." She listened silently, her expression unreadable. When he finished, there was a long pause before she spoke. "Do you even know what you're apologizing for?" she asked, her tone sharp but controlled. "You didn't just leave me that day. You left everything we built together. You left me to suffer alone, to question my worth, to pick up the pieces of a life you shattered. And now, because you've realized you made a mistake, you think you can just waltz back in and make it right." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had hoped for forgiveness or at least understanding, but her response made it clear that she had moved on in ways he hadn't anticipated. "I don't need your apology," she continued, her voice steady but firm. "What I needed was for you to choose me when it mattered. And you didn't. So no, I don't forgive you. And I don't think I ever will." Her words were final, and he knew there was no point in trying to argue. He nodded slowly, accepting her decision, even though it tore him apart inside. "I understand," he said quietly. I hope you find happiness." She smiled faintly, but it wasn't a smile of warmth, it was a smile of closure. "I already have," she said before standing up and walking away, leaving him sitting alone at the table, a broken man. As he watched her leave, he felt the full weight of his choices. He had lost the one person who truly loved him, not because of fate or circumstance, but because of his own actions. And now all he could do was live with the consequences. For her, the meeting was cathartic. It wasn't about forgiveness. It was about reclaiming her power and making it clear that she was no longer defined by his betrayal. She walked away from the cafe with her head held high, feeling lighter than she had in years. She had faced the man who had once broken her, and she had come out stronger. For the first time in a long time, she felt truly free.